I am presenting Union Gospel Press's Sunday School Lesson number 3, Sunday, June 16th, 2024. Happy Father's Day. The lesson is entitled Ruth Follows Naomi. Lesson text comes from Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 9, verse 14b, and verse 16. Related scriptures are Judges 2, 11 through 19, Matthew 19, 27 through 30. The place is Moab. The time is between 1120 and 1130 BC. Our lesson this week focuses on two women, Naomi and Ruth, and their loyal love for one another. Today's aim, facts, to show how one young woman from Moab found refuge in a family who knew the true God. Principle, to affirm that our families can be places of refuge and safety if we follow God's order for them. Application, to show how we can make our families places of community when we leave behind our old life and choose to follow Christ. Illustrating the lesson, Ruth, a foreigner, chose to find a home with Naomi in Bethlehem. God invites all to accept a place in his own family. Practical points. 1. God's people are not automatically exempt from the difficulties of life. Ruth 1, 1 through 2. 2. Sometimes God chooses to allow circumstances that leave him as our only hope. Verses 3 through 5. 3. The wise person recognizes that every good thing is from God. Ruth 1, 6, Matthew 5, 45, James 1, 17. 4. No matter how difficult or how uncertain the outcome, take the next biblical step. Ruth 1, 7. 5. Our own difficulties should never preclude our desire for God's blessing on others. Verses 8 through 9. 6. Following God involves sacrifice, but also the hope of his sure provision. Verses 14 and 16. Golden text. Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." Ruth 1:16. Today we have 4 lesson outlines. The first is a family migration, Ruth 1, 1 through 2. The second is a family tragedy, Ruth 1, 3 through 5. The third is a family parting, Ruth 1, 6 through 9. And the fourth is a family loyalty, Ruth 1, 14b and 16. Introduction. The family is the basic unit of a community. When family units suffer, the whole community suffers. Heartbreaking stories of family tragedies permeate the newspapers and newscasts today. We hear not only of house fires, traffic accidents, and neighborhood shootings that claim children's lives, but also of horrible dysfunctions within family units. Spouses divorce and fight for the children. Former spouses kidnap children. Disturbed parents beat, molest, or even killed unwanted or disabled children. Ironically, out of such wretched conditions come some unlikely stories of success and love. God bestows grace so that the selfish, abusive, poor, handicapped, and abused can be transformed and may yet glorify him and bless their communities with good deeds. Such is the outcome of the biblical account of Naomi and Ruth. It begins as a family tragedy, but it ends in a way that brings blessing to Israel and all mankind. Our lesson unfolds the beginning of this remarkable account. A family migration, Ruth 1, 1. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Verse 2. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there. The famine in Judah, Ruth 1:1a. The events in the book of Ruth occurred in the days when the judges ruled. Politically, these were chaotic days when Israel had no central government. Spiritually, there was frequent apostasy, and God chastised his people through foreign invasions. The book of Ruth, in contrast to Judges, portrays a local community of those times undisturbed by warfare. It reveals peaceful contacts between Israelites and their Moabite neighbors. And it shows that even in a time of apostasy, some still strongly trusted the Lord. Conditions were not ideal, however, for the land was under a severe famine. We are not informed about its cause, though inadequate rainfall usually was to blame. We also do not know whether it was local or widespread throughout Israel. We are not explicitly told whether God brought about this famine as a punishment for sin or for some other reason. It is merely mentioned as the cause for a family's departure from the land. The migration to Moab, Ruth 1:1b through 2. The family at the center of this narrative lived in Bethlehem in the tribe of Judah. Ironically, Bethlehem means house of bread, and its name reflected the bounty of the region. But now even Bethlehem experienced scarcity. So the man and his family, identified in the next verse, left Israel for the land of Moab. He intended to sojourn there, that is, to stay temporarily until the famine ended. Moab was a country southeast of Israel on the opposite side of the Dead Sea. Its people were the descendants of Lot through his oldest daughter's incest with him. Genesis 19:37. During Israel's journey to Canaan, the king of Moab had resisted them by hiring Balaam to curse them. Numbers 22:1 through 6. Because of this, Moabites were barred from participating in Israel's national life. Deuteronomy 23:3 through 6. Nevertheless, some persons of these nations had friendly relations. The persons in the migrating family are identified in Ruth 1 and 2. The head of the household was Elimelech, whose name means my God is king. His wife was Naomi, whose name means pleasant or delightful. The names of their sons may hint at physical problems. Mahlon, weak, sickly, and Chilion, wasting, piney. These people are called Ephrathites. Ephrathite was the original name for Bethlehem, Genesis 35:19, Micah 5:2. Thus, an Ephrathite was simply an inhabitant of Bethlehem, though this older designation may indicate that they were descendants of one of the older established families of the area. The migrate even temporarily to a foreign land was a drastic measure, and Elimelech had been criticized for doing so. Why could he not trust God to supply his family needs in Bethlehem? Others apparently stayed there and survived. Were not the hardships that followed this family evidence that they were out of God's will? Yet the text does not condemn or praise Elimelech, and we must take care not to reach hasty conclusions. A family tragedy, verse 3. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Verse 4. And they took them wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. Verse 5. And Mahlon and Chilion died also, both of them, and the women was left of her 2 sons and her husband. The death of Elimelech. Ruth 1:3. This family escaped the famine only to suffer more severely. First, Naomi's husband died. With only this bare statement, we do not know how long they had been in Moab when this occurred, or what their economic condition was at the time. But we do know that the words, and she was left, carried serious implications. The death of a family head would have been a severe blow even in Bethlehem, for it would deprive her of all livelihood. How much worse when it happened in a foreign land. Naomi was left with her 2 sons, which in her circumstances was more a blessing than a burden. They were probably young adults at this time and could work to support themselves and their mother. Naomi could also take comfort that despite their father's death, they could perpetuate the family's name. The marriage of the sons. Ruth 1:4. We might expect Naomi and her sons to return to Bethlehem after the death of Elimelech. There they would at least have the support of their community. Instead, they put down roots more firmly in Moab when the young men married Moabite women. The names of the 2 wives were Orpah and Ruth. This text does not tell us which wife married which man. We only learned in 4:10 that Ruth was married to Mahlon. Although the Mosaic law does not specifically forbid intermarriage with Moabites, it does strongly imply that it was ordinarily sinful. Deuteronomy 7:1-6, 23, 6-7. Nehemiah confirmed this when he pronounced a curse on Israelites married to Moabites. Nehemiah 13:23-27. Such intermarriage posed a spiritual danger since Moab worshipped a false god. Numbers 21:29. In fact, it was Moabite women who seduced Israel to worship Baal-peor in the wilderness. 25:1-3. These marriages entailed perils that were best to avoid. Boaz's marriage to Ruth may be the only recorded lawful marriage to a Moabite in the Old Testament. Israelites could marry converts. After this, Naomi and her sons continued to live in Moab. About 10 years, Ruth 1:4, could refer to either the time after they arrived or the time after the marriages. In either case, the intended land of sojourn had seemingly become a permanent residence. The death of the sons. Ruth 1:5. Now, without explanation, the deaths of the 2 sons are reported. This left Naomi in a most pitiful condition. The family had disintegrated. The only ones left were 3 widows, and the 2 young women could be of little help to Naomi. She was deprived of all income and faced a future of poverty. In that time, a woman without a man's support was destitute, for economic life centered around the family. Naomi also faced the end of the family name, for she was too old to bear more sons. With the utter hopelessness of her situation must have come questions. Was there any meaning in this? Why did God allow it to happen? Was she in any way responsible for all of this? A family party. Verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab how the Lord had visited his people living, giving them bread. Verse 7. Wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return unto the land of Judah. Verse 8. And Naomi said unto her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as ye have dealt with the dead and with me. Verse 9. The Lord grant you that ye may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept. The decision of Naomi, Ruth 1, 6 through 7. At least one piece of good news reached Naomi at this time. The Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. In his sovereignty, he had ended the famine in Judah. Naomi therefore decided to return to Bethlehem. Moab had no further attraction for her, and she had reason for wanting to escape its hold on her life and her memories. She would be better off among her relatives in Bethlehem. As she made her way homeward, her daughters-in-law accompanied her. They no doubt considered it their duty to do so. By marrying into an Israelite family, Orpah and Ruth had severed some ties with their own people. But now that their husbands had died, they were in an awkward situation. In a sense, they were women without a country, since their family ties on both sides had been dissolved. For the moment, Naomi was their only point of identification, so they went with her. Their willingness to break ties with their homeland and to enter an alien culture also gives evidence of a close bond of loyalty. They apparently love Naomi and refuse to let her face the future alone. Their affection speaks well of their character. It also speaks well of Naomi, whose godly virtues had attracted such loyalty. Here, then, were 3 women united by a common grief and facing an uncertain future, but they determined to face it together. The parting of the women, Ruth 1, 8 through 9. Naomi recognized the difficulties Orpah and Ruth would face in Israel. They were young, with hopes of remarrying and rearing families, but their prospects of finding husbands in Bethlehem were slim because of cultural barriers. So she released them from any obligation to her. Go, return each to her mother's house, she said. We might have expected her to say father's house, but she was referring to the woman's quarters of their homes. Their mothers could comfort them, and they could prepare for another marriage. Naomi prayed that the Lord would deal kindly with the 2 women. It is noteworthy that she invoked the kindness of the Lord of Israel, not Chemosh, the false deity of Moab. Naomi had been away from her homeland for 10 years, but she still held firmly to her faith in the Lord. Apparently, she had also imparted an understanding of her faith to her daughter-in-laws. Furthermore, in using the expression deal kindly or show kindness, verse 8, Naomi used the Hebrew word that refers to the loyal love established by a covenant. It is often used to describe God's covenant dealings with Israel, but here she prayed that he might extend this covenant love to foreigners as well. She had seen evidence of this same kindness in them when they had displayed to their husbands and to her. She then invoked the Lord's favor on these young women a second time. The Lord grant you that ye may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband, verse 9. Rest here refers to the security a woman had through marriage. In their case, it meant a release from the worries and troubles their widowhood would bring. It was unlikely that they could experience this in Bethlehem. Their Moabite culture could provide greater opportunities for remarriage. Naomi kissed Orpah and Ruth as she anticipated a final parting, but this merely stirred their emotions. They broke out into loud weeping. As they wept, they protested that they would indeed stay with Naomi. But she discouraged them, arguing that she would have no more sons for them to marry. Why should they stay with someone whom God had forsaken? A family loyalty. Verse 14. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her. Verse 16. And Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Ruth's decision, Ruth 1:14b. After more tears, Orpah made her decision. She kissed Naomi goodbye and turned back. Naomi's advice sounded sensible. If she ever wanted to remarry, this was apparently the way to achieve it. Having been forced to examine her values, Orpah decided that becoming a wife again was more important than remaining a daughter-in-law to Naomi. Ruth, however, cleaved to her mother-in-law. She had counted the cost no less than Orpah and had reached the opposite conclusion. Her life would henceforth be with Naomi, whatever the sacrifice. The Hebrew term for cleave indicates the closest possible loyalty and affection. It is the word used to describe the ideal relationship between husband and wife, Genesis 2:24. Ruth's identity would be tied to Naomi. Ruth's dedication, Ruth 1:16. One last time, Naomi tried to dissuade Ruth, verse 15. She reminded her that Orpah had returned to her people and gods, and she urged Ruth to do likewise. This was bad spiritual advice, but Naomi was thinking only of the earthly happiness Ruth would gain. Ruth was adamant, however. She begged Naomi to stop entreating her to return. She declared that she would go where Naomi went and lodge where she lodged, both along the way and both in Judah. She would share the circumstances of Naomi's life, but she went even further. Thy people shall be my people. Ruth would cease being a Moabite and would identify with a new society with new customs and laws. This inevitably entailed a new spiritual identity. And thy God, my God. Ruth had seen a spiritual dimension in this Israelite family that she wanted for herself. She trusted the Lord and would worship him. Ruth declared that she would stay with Naomi until death separated them, and even then she would be buried at the same place. She concluded with a solemn oath to the God of Israel. Ruth's example remains a challenge for every subsequent generation to imitate. She had seen in her family a minister of the community of faith in Israel, and she desired to be a part of it. So she made a choice and commitment that altered her life and Naomi's. Questions. 1. How does the portrayal of life in Israel differ in the books of Judges and Ruth? 2. Where did Elimelech and his family live? Why did they go to Moab? 3. Who were the Moabites? How had they dealt with Israel? 4. What peril attended the marriage of Israelites and Moabites? 5. What tragedies befell this Israelite family in Moab? 6. What kind of future did Naomi face after her husband and sons died? 7. What factors led Naomi to decide to return to Bethlehem? 8. How did Naomi's daughter-in-laws initially respond when she urged them to return to Moab? 9. Why did Orpah return to her home? 10. What level of commitment it is expressed in Ruth's cleaving to Naomi? This concludes the Sunday school lesson for Sunday, June 16, 2024. Thank you for listening. God bless.